It started like any normal shift. Just me, my radio, and the endless stretch of forest beneath Tower 12. I had been working as a Forest Service ranger for about a year now. It wasn't exactly the kind of life I had planned, but it had its appeal. The isolation, the quiet, the feeling of being apart from the rest of the world. I had grown up in a small town, but after too many years in the city, I needed out. Too much noise, too many people, and a job that felt like it was slowly killing me. Then I saw a posting for fire watch duty in one of the national parks, and something about it called to me. It sounded peaceful. It sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I packed up, took the training. The silence was deafening. At first, I'd wake up to the sound of wind rustling through the pines, the occasional howl of a coyote, and the static-filled voices of the other rangers over the radio. Most shifts were boring. The job was simple. Watch for fires, report anything strange, keep checking in. It was lonely, sure, but I liked it. And the nights were the loneliest of all. That's when I started looking for company, even if it was just a voice on the radio. The other rangers were stationed in towers miles apart, but we kept in contact during night shifts. Some guys barely talked at all, just a quick check-in, a muttered update about the weather, then radio silence. But some liked to talk. The closest one to me was Ranger Blake from Tower 5. He had been out here for years, and you could tell. He had that old-timer way of talking, slow and steady, never in a rush to say anything. We started talking every night. At first, it was the usual stuff: weather, strange animal sightings, the boredom of fire watch duty. But over time, we got comfortable, too comfortable. Blake told me about the things he had seen out here, the lights in the woods that had no source, the sounds that came from places no one had been in years. And then there was Ranger Donahue from Tower 9. He was younger than Blake, but he had been working the towers for 3 years already. Unlike Blake, he didn't love the job. He was tired of it, tired of the isolation, tired of the silence. He once told me, "The trees start talking to you after a while, man. You'll see." I thought he was joking. I thought they were all just trying to scare the new guy. And maybe they were. But then there was Ranger Scott from Tower 3. He was different. Scott didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always in that quiet, uneasy way, like he was always half distracted by something else. "Don't look at the clearings at night," he told me once. I laughed it off, but then he said, "I'm serious. If you see a clearing, look away. Close your eyes if you have to." That stuck with me. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. For weeks, things were normal. Just long nights, lonely conversations over the radio, and the occasional creepy story from the veterans. Until that one night, the night the voice spoke back to me. Nights in the watchtower had a way of stretching out. Hours felt longer, the silence heavier, and the world beyond the windows darker than it had any right to be. After enough time out here, you learned that talking was the best way to keep your mind occupied. I'd gotten used to chatting with Blake during the long shifts. His voice crackling over the radio had become comforting in a way, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone out here. That night started like any other. Just two guys killing time, talking about nothing and everything. A normal conversation. "Man, did you hear that storm last night?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Blake chuckled, his voice fuzzy through the static. "I thought my whole damn tower was gonna tip over. That wind was insane." "Yeah, Tower 12 was shaking too, felt like an earthquake. Wouldn't be the first time we lost a tower in a storm." I hesitated. "Wait, what?" Blake made a hum sound, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to elaborate. Back in '97, Tower 6 collapsed during a windstorm. Whole thing came down with the ranger inside. A chill ran down my spine. Jesus, what happened to him? Dead on impact. A pause. Or so they say. I frown. What do you mean? Blake sighs. Nothing, just let's say people have heard things near Tower 6 since then. I rolled my eyes. Yeah. More spooky ranger stories. You guys love messing with me. He chuckled. We gotta do something to keep you on your toes, kid. I smirked, shaking my head. Well, you're gonna have to try harder than that. The radio crackled, and for a moment there was just silence. Then Blake sighs again. It was a different kind of sigh this time. Something heavier, like he had something on his mind. Then out of nowhere he asked, "You ever done something bad, Matt?" The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I sat up straighter, suddenly feeling more awake. Like what? Another pause. Then calmly, too calmly, he said, "I've killed people." I let out a short laugh, waiting for him to tell me he was joking, but he didn't. The static hummed between us, stretching the silence until it became unbearable. I forced a chuckle. All right, Blake, that's a good one. You almost had me. Still, he didn't laugh, didn't say anything. My fingers hovered over the radio, heart pounding. Blake? Finally, his voice came back, low even, like he was talking about the weather. I mean it, Matt. I've killed people. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. This conversation wasn't normal anymore. The static hummed in my ears, filling the gap between us like something alive. And then, first time was a hitchhiker, Blake said casually, like he was talking about the weather. Picked him up outside of Fort Row. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My fingers tightened around the radio, my knuckles aching from the pressure. Blake didn't notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He was running from something, he continued. Who knows what? Looked scared, desperate. So I pulled over. His voice had a distant quality to it, like he was remembering, playing the scene back in his head. I forced my throat to work, my voice coming out tight. And then? The radio crackled. Then his voice came back, low and steady. And then I buried him where no one would ever find him. A long silence stretched out between us. I could hear my own breathing, the way it shook just slightly. I was half convinced Blake was joking, some twisted way to mess with the new guy. But there was no humor in his voice, no teasing. Just cold memory. I swallowed hard. When was this? Blake hesitated. Then, long time ago. Why are you telling me this? My voice barely sounded like my own. Another pause. Then he said something that froze my blood. Because you won't tell anyone. I felt a cold wave of dread roll through me. You don't know that, I said carefully. I do, Blake murmured. You're out here, just like me. No one to talk to, no one who really knows you're here. It changes you, Matt. Being alone this long, you start to understand things differently. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. You ever wonder why people go missing in national parks? He asked suddenly. A nervous chill prickled along my arms. What? I'm just saying. His voice was almost amused now. People come through here all the time. Campers, hikers, loners, not all of them make it out. My mouth went dry. Did you? Blake cut me off. I never go looking for it, you know. That was the worst part. The way he said it, like it was just something that happened. Like it was inevitable. But sometimes, they come to me. The words hung in the air, thick with implication. I didn't want to know what he meant, but some horrible part of me did. Because I was out here too, alone, with nothing but the trees, the darkness, and the voice of a man who had just confessed to murder. "Matt," Blake said suddenly. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. "What? Do you believe me?" I stared at the radio, my hands still trembling. I didn't want to, but I did. God help me, I did. I should have cut contact, should have reported him, should have done something, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed on the radio, night after night, listening to every word he said. And Blake told me everything. "The jogger," he said one night, his voice calm, too calm. "She ran too far into the woods." I stared out into the blackness beyond Tower 12, gripping the radio so tightly my fingers ached. "I heard her before I saw her," Blake continued. "Her breathing, fast, frantic. She knew she wasn't alone." I didn't say anything, didn't dare interrupt him. "She kept looking over her shoulder," he murmured, "like she could feel something right behind her. But it wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion." Silence. Then, it was me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And the camper?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. "They wandered off alone," Blake said smoothly. "Night hiker. Thought they knew the trails. But the trails change, you know." I didn't know. I didn't want to know. "They walked in circles for hours," he continued. "Didn't even realize it. But I watched." I could hear the smile in his voice. "I like watching." And then there were more. One night, Blake was quiet for a long time. Then softly, "You ever wonder how many people get lost out here, Matt?" I didn't answer. Didn't trust myself to speak. "I could tell you," he said, "but I don't think you want to know." I forced myself to respond. "Tell me anyway." He exhaled, a long, slow breath crackling over the radio. Then he started. "Teenager," he said, "looking for freedom, found something else." "The couple?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Broke down on an abandoned road," Blake replied. "They knocked on the wrong cabin. 2 boys. Said they wanted to spend the night in the woods, prove they weren't scared." "Were they?" Blake chuckled. "Not at first. The park ranger." I froze. "A ranger?" "Yeah, new guy, like you." I nearly dropped the radio. The countless others, some names I remember. Most I don't. "How many, Blake?" He didn't answer at first. Then, "Enough. Nobody looks for them out here," he finally said. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "The forest eats everything." It was a quiet night. Too quiet. The kind of night where the wind barely moved, where even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Blake hadn't spoken for a while, which was rare. He always had something to say, some story, some twisted memory to share. But tonight the radio had been silent. That should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because I knew deep down that when Blake was quiet, it only meant he was thinking. And that was never a good thing. Then, his voice crackled through the speaker. "You ever think about it, Matt?" I froze. My hand hovered over the radio, suddenly unsure if I even wanted to respond. Something in his tone, low, measured, almost casual, made my skin crawl. I cleared my throat. "Think about what?" A long pause. Then, "Killing someone." My mouth went dry. I felt an icy weight settle in my stomach, a slow, creeping dread that clawed its way up my spine. I should have ended the conversation right then. Should have ignored him, turned the radio off, reported him the next morning. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed on the line, talking, because I was afraid not to. I forced my voice to stay steady. "No." Another pause, then softly, "Liar." A chill raced through me. "I'm not lying." "Everybody thinks about it," Blake murmured, "even if they won't admit it." The radio hummed with static, filling the silence like a second presence in the room. I swallowed hard. Not me. Blake chuckled, low and knowing. You're out here, just like me, Matt. His voice was too calm, too sure. Spending night after night, watching, waiting, thinking. I didn't say anything, because I knew he was watching me now, even from miles away, from his own tower. You ever wonder what it's like? He asked. What? To end something. I gripped the edge of the desk, my fingers digging into the wood. Blake, you need to stop. Why? His voice was genuine, like he really wanted an answer. You think you're different from me, don't you? I know I am. Blake was silent for a moment. Then he let out a soft sigh. That's what I used to think too. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I pressed the power button on the radio, but the voice kept going. It starts small, he continued like he was telling a story. A thought, a curiosity. Then you start noticing things, like how easy it would be to make someone disappear out here. I felt sick. I don't think about that, Blake. Sure you do. I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. You don't know me. I know you better than you think. His voice was too confident, like he had already decided something about me, like he was just waiting for me to realize it. The static hummed louder, filling my ears, making the room feel smaller. And then finally, Blake spoke again. I'm just saying, Matt. Another long pause. Then, one day, you might find out you're just like me. The radio clicked off, and I sat there staring into the darkness, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Because for the first time since taking this job, I didn't feel alone anymore. I wasn't sleeping much anymore. Not after the things Blake had told me. Most nights, I just sat at my desk, listening to the wind howl through the trees, staring out at the endless stretch of black forest beneath Tower 12. My hands hovered over the radio more times than I could count, debating whether to call someone, anyone. But who would believe me? Blake had done this before, too many times. He knew how to pick the right kind of victim, the ones nobody would look for. And if I called the wrong person, I'd be the next one on his list. I tried to push the thought away, forcing myself to focus on anything else. That's when I noticed it. A corner of paper, sticking out from under my desk. A map. I hadn't seen it before. I bent down and pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. At first, I thought it was just one of the standard issue topographical maps we all had in our towers, marked with trails, fire lines, and elevation markers. But then I saw them. The X's, small, black X marks, scattered across the map. Dozens of them, each one labeled with a date, some going back years. Others were recent, too recent. A chill crawled up my spine. This wasn't just any map. It was Blake's map. My breathing turned shallow as I scanned the locations. Some of the X's were near old campsites. Others in deep, unmarked sections of the woods. I recognized one immediately. The clearing behind Tower 6, the one Blake had told me not to look at. I ran my finger over the ink, feeling my hands tremble. How did this get here? I flipped the map over, and that's when I saw it. A message, scrawled at the bottom, in faint black marker. A message just for me. You see it now, don't you? You understand. You're one of us. My blood turned to ice. The words felt heavy, like they were pressing into my skull, drilling deeper with every second I stared at them. I shoved my chair back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This map, this thing, wasn't mine. It was never mine. Blake had been here, inside my tower, while I was sleeping, while I was out on the catwalk, watching the trees, thinking I was alone. He had walked in, left this for me, because he knew I'd find it. I glanced at the radio, half expecting it to crackle to life, to hear his voice, to hear him laughing, to hear him say something, anything. But the radio stayed silent. No laughter, no teasing, no threats, because he didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. Blake had been here, and he wanted me to know it. I wasn't just watching from my tower anymore. I was being watched. That night, I tried to avoid the radio. I didn't even sit at my desk like I usually did. Instead, I paced the small cabin of Tower 12, my mind racing. I kept looking at the map, still spread out where I had left it, as if expecting the markings to somehow change or disappear. But they didn't. Neither did the message at the bottom. You see it now, don't you? You understand. You're one of us. I had turned the radio off, but at exactly midnight, it crackled to life on its own. A burst of static. Then, Matt. Blake's voice was different tonight. Flat, cold. You there? I stood frozen, staring at the radio, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't answer. You looked, didn't you? His voice wasn't teasing anymore. It wasn't playful, like it had been before. There was no laughter, only certainty. He knew. I swallowed hard, stepping closer to the desk, my hand hovering over the radio. Then, for the first time, I pressed the button and spoke first. You were in my tower. Silence, then. I was. A slow, dreadful confirmation. I gritted my teeth, gripping the edge of the desk. Why? A pause. Then, Blake's voice came back, low and steady. I wanted to see if you were ready. Ready for what? I hissed. Another pause. Then, to understand. I clenched my fists. You left the map. I did. You want me to be like you? The radio crackled. Then, I think you already are. I felt rage boiling in my chest, my fear mixing with something worse. I'm not like you. Blake chuckled. It wasn't lighthearted. It was knowing. You keep talking to me, don't you? I opened my mouth, then shut it. Because he was right. And I hated that he was right. I had every chance to stop listening, to report him, to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I was standing here, arguing with him, feeding into it. I turned the radio off, and for the first time in weeks, I locked my cabin door. But somehow, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound was too real. A slow, deliberate creak with each step, the kind of sound that didn't belong in the dead of night. My breath hitched. I shot up in bed, my heart thundering. No, it couldn't be him. He was miles away, wasn't he? I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a long, horrible moment, there was nothing. Only my own ragged breathing filling the cabin. I told myself it was the wind, maybe an animal, maybe even my mind playing tricks on me. And then, a knock, soft, patient. My entire body locked up. I could feel my pulse in my throat, a cold, twisting dread wrapping around my ribs like a vice. Then, a voice. Familiar. Too familiar. Matt, open up. I felt every hair on my body stand on end. Blake. He was here. He found me. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. This isn't happening. He's miles away. But I knew the truth. He wasn't in Tower 5 anymore. He was here, standing outside my door. A voice crackled over the radio, but I hadn't turned it on. Static. Then, I know you're awake, Matt. The breath I had been holding in came out in a sharp, shaky exhale. My hands were slick with sweat, my skin cold despite the heat in the cabin. He had been talking to me through the radio for weeks. But now he was here, standing just a few feet away, on the other side of the door. I thought about the map, the markings, the message he left me. "You're one of us." No, I wasn't. And I knew now. Blake had never been asking me a question. He was giving me a choice, and I had made it. I wasn't like him, which meant he couldn't let me leave. Another knock, this time louder. The doorknob jiggled, testing, checking to see if it was locked. I grabbed my knife from my desk drawer, gripping it so tightly my fingers burned. Then, in a voice lower than before, "I don't like when people ignore me, Matt." The door rattled. I stumbled backward, pressing my spine against the wall, my chest rising and falling too fast. I reached for the radio, clicking it on with shaky hands. "Go away, Blake." Silence. Then, "Come on, I just want to talk." I didn't answer. "Matt, if you don't open this door." My fingers tightened around the knife. The next words came softly. "I'll find another way in." Chapter 9. The Last Warning. The door handle jiggled again. Harder this time, not just testing anymore. Trying. A sharp metallic click echoed through the cabin as Blake jimmied something into the lock. I didn't wait. I grabbed the rifle from where it sat against the wall. I'd never used it before, never even had to think about it. But right now I wasn't thinking. I was acting. I stepped toward the door, my hands trembling as I raised the barrel, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The door handle jiggled again. Harder this time. Not just testing anymore, trying. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the cabin as Blake jimmied something into the lock. I didn't wait. I grabbed the rifle from where it sat against the wall. I'd never used it before. Never even had to think about it. But right now I wasn't thinking. I was acting. I stepped toward the door, my hands trembling as I raised the barrel, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "Blake, get the hell out of here!" Silence. Then, a slow chuckle. "Come on, Matt." His voice was muffled through the wood. "Put that thing down. You and I both know you don't have it in you." A beat of silence. Then, a loud thud. Blake had slammed his shoulder against the door. "Open up." I flinched. The door rattled in its frame, the wood creaking under the pressure. I raised the rifle and took a step back, heart hammering so hard I thought it might shake the gun right out of my hands. "Last warning," I shouted. Blake laughed again. "You're not a killer, Matt." Then, a splintering sound. The lock snapped. The door swung open. And for the first time, I saw him. Blake. He stood in the doorway, tall, still smiling. His eyes, dark, empty pits that didn't belong to a man, but to something hungry. Something decided. He took a slow step forward. "I never liked locked doors," he murmured. I pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot exploded through the cabin, deafening, shaking the walls. Blake staggered back, his expression twisting in shock. He clutched his side, blood blossoming through his shirt. For a second, he just stared at me, mouth slightly open, like he couldn't believe it. Then he dropped to his knees, gasping, bleeding, falling. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My hands froze on the rifle, my vision blurring. Then Blake laughed, a wet, broken sound. "Guess I was wrong about you." He coughed, blood trickling from his lips. I stayed where I was, the gun still trained on him. Then I saw it, his backpack just inside the doorway, half unzipped, something glinting inside. I took a shaky step forward, keeping the rifle raised, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't stop me, He was too weak now. I crouched down and pulled open the bag, and that's when my blood went cold. Inside, a knife, a long hunting blade, a coil of rope, a zippered black pouch. I hesitated, then unzipped it. Inside were silver handcuffs, a syringe, and a roll of duct tape. My stomach dropped. I reached deeper into the bag. A piece of paper, folded. I pulled it out and opened it with trembling fingers. It was a map, like the one I'd found in my tower, with one last X mark right on Tower 12. I stared at it, my mind spinning, heart racing. Blake had already marked me. He had been planning this. Tonight was never a game. He had come to kill me. I looked back at him. He was still smiling, slumped against the wall, blood soaking his shirt. His eyes drooped, but that smile, that goddamn smile, stayed. "You get it now, don't you?" he whispered. I clenched my jaw. I didn't answer. I just watched him bleed. The sirens echoed through the forest, a sound I never thought I'd hear out here. For weeks, it had been just me, my tower, and the endless, lonely silence of the woods. Now the whole place was swarming with police. I stood off to the side, wrapped in a blanket I didn't remember someone handing me, my mind still reeling. Blake was gone. I still didn't know if he had bled out before they arrived, or if he was still breathing when they loaded him into the ambulance. I didn't care, because Blake was just one monster. What he had left behind, that was so much worse. The discovery. They found his cabin deep in the woods, miles away from Tower 5, a place not on any maps, a place he must have used for years. Inside, they found his trophies, personal belongings from people who were supposed to be missing persons cases, hikers, campers, lone travelers. Some of them had been missing for months, some for years. A few had never even been reported. One detective, a woman with tired eyes and a grim expression, pulled me aside. "We're looking at more than 20 victims, Matt. Probably a lot more. 20, more than 20. I had spent weeks thinking Blake was just a killer in the woods, a man who had done terrible things, but I hadn't known the half of it. They dug up the places marked on his map. Each X was a grave, some shallow, some deep, all of them filled with secrets the forest had kept for years. It was like the woods had been hiding a sickness, and now that sickness was being dragged into the light. The interrogation. The police asked me everything. I told them about the radio conversations, about the things Blake had confessed to me, about the night he tried to get into my tower. And then I told them the worst part, that he had planned it all, that he had marked my tower, that I was supposed to be his next victim. I watched as the officers exchanged looks, the weight of it settling on them too. One of them shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive." I nodded, because I was. Over the next few weeks, families started to come forward. People who had spent years without answers, who had clung to hope that their loved ones had just disappeared, not died. I sat in on some of the interviews, hearing the names of people Blake had hunted, seeing the faces of the ones he had left behind. It was horrible, but in some way, it was also a relief, because at least now they knew. At least now, there was no more wondering. I didn't feel like a hero. I had spent too long listening to him, letting him talk, letting him sink into my mind like poison. But I had stopped him, and in the end, that was enough. The Rangers offered to transfer me. I didn't take it. The woods still belonged to me, not to Blake, not anymore. I stayed in Tower 12. I still watched the trees at night. But now, when the radio crackled to life, it wasn't Blake's voice I heard, just the wind, just the quiet. and that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Click the bell icon so you never miss any new content. Stay tuned for more creepy stories coming soon. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the dark, subscribe for more. Because the best horror isn't what you hear, it's what follows when the story is over.